All right, folks, this is our marijuana timeline. In the 1600s, domestic production of hemp was encouraged. In the 1890s, American production of hemp was encouraged by the government in the 17th century for the production of rope, sails, and clothing. Marijuana is a mixture of dried, shredded flowers and leaves that come from a hemp plant. In 1619, the Virginia Assembly passed legislation requiring every farmer to grow hemp. Domestic production flourished until after the Civil War. During the 19th century, hashish became a fad in France and also, to some extent, in the U.S. In 1906 was the Pure Food and Drug Act. It required labeling of any cannabis contained in over-the-counter remedies. In the 1900s through the 1920s, Mexican immigrants introduced recreational use of marijuana leaf. In the 1930s began the fear of marijuana. During the Great Depression, massive unemployment increased public resentment and fear of Mexican immigrants, escalating public and governmental concern about the problem of marijuana. This instigated a flurry of research which linked the use of marijuana with violence, crime, and other socially deviant behaviors, primarily committed by racially inferior or underclass communities. In 1931, 29 states had outlawed marijuana. In 1930, we witnessed the creation of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the FBN. In 1932, the Uniform State Narcotics Acts, concerned about the rising use of marijuana and research linking its use to crime and other social problems, created pressure on the federal government to take action. Rather than promoting federal legislation, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics strongly encouraged state governments to accept responsibility for control of the problem by adapting to the Uniform State Narcotics Act. In 1936, Reefer Madness. Propaganda film Reefer Madness was produced by the French director Louis Gassier. The Motion Picture Association of America, composed of the major Hollywood studios, banned the show of any narcotics in films. In 1937, we saw a rise to the Marijuana Tax Act. After a lurid national propaganda campaign against the evil weed, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act. The statute effectively criminalized marijuana, restricting possession of the drug to individuals who paid an excess tax for certain authorized medical and industrial uses. In 1944, a LaGuardia report found that marijuana was less dangerous. In 1940s, hemp for victory. During World War II, imports of hemp and other materials crucial for producing marine cordage, parachutes, and other military necessities became scarce. In response, the U.S. Department of Agriculture launched its Hemp for Victory program, encouraging farmers to plant hemp by giving out seeds and granting draft deferments to those who would stay home and grow hemp. By 1943, American farmers registered in the program harvested 375,000 acres of hemp. In 1951 through 1956, we saw stricter sentencing laws, enactment of federal laws which set mandatory sentences for drug-related offenses, including marijuana. A first offense marijuana possession carried a minimum sentence of 2 to 10 years, with a fine of up to $20,000. In the 1960s, we saw marijuana use popularized in counterculture. A changing political and cultural climate was reflected in more lenient attitudes towards marijuana. Use of the drug became widespread in the upper middle class. Reports commissioned by President Kennedy and Johnson found that marijuana use did not induce violence nor lead to use of heavier drugs. Policy towards marijuana began to involve considerations of treatment as well as criminal penalties. In 1968, creation of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. This was a merger of FBN and the Bureau of Dangerous Drugs of the Food and Drug Administration. In 1970, repeal of most mandatory minimum sentences. Congress repealed most of the mandatory penalties for drug-related offenses. It is widely acknowledged that the mandatory minimum sentences of the 1950s had done nothing to eliminate the drug culture that embraced marijuana use throughout the 60s, and that the minimum sentences imposed were often unduly harsh. Marijuana differentiated from other drugs. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act categorized marijuana separately from other narcotics and eliminated mandatory federal sentences for possession of small amounts. In 1972 was the Schaefer Commission. A bipartisan Schaefer Commission, appointed by the President Nixon at the direction of Congress, considered laws regarding marijuana and determined that personal use of marijuana should be decriminalized. Nixon rejected the recommendation, but over the course of the 1970s, 11 states decriminalized marijuana and most others reduced their penalties. In 1973, creation of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA. Merger of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs and the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement. In 1974, High Times was founded. In 1976 was the beginning of parents' movement against marijuana. A nationwide movement emerged of conservative parents groups lobbying for stricter regulation of marijuana and the prevention of drug use by teenagers. Some of these groups became quite powerful and, with the support of the DEA and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, were instrumental in affecting public attitudes which led to the 1980s war on drugs. In 1986 was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, mandatory sentences. President Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, instituting mandatory sentencing for drug-related crimes. In conjunction with the Comprehensive Act Control Act of 1984, the new law raised federal penalties for marijuana possession and dealing, basing the penalties on the amount of the drug involved. Possession of 100 marijuana plants receiving the same penalty as possession of 100 grams of heroin. A later amendment to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act established a 3 strikes and you're out policy, requiring life sentences for repeat drug offenders and providing for the death penalty for known drug kingpins. In 1989, Bush's war on drugs. President George Bush declares a new war on drugs in a nationally televised speech. In 1996, medical use was legalized in California. California voters passed Proposition 215, allowing for the sale and medical use of marijuana for patients with AIDS, cancer, and other serious and painful diseases. This law stands in tension with federal laws prohibiting possession of marijuana. Since 1996, several states have joined with the fight to legalize marijuana, yet some other states venomously oppose it. Only time will tell if the country will fully accept marijuana usages for medical purposes. So there are a lot of different terms that people use to refer to marijuana.
Weed, grass, ganja, joint, doobie, do, chronic, ace, lobo, loco, love boat, bud, Buddha, blunt, pot, hat, pin, chiba, chiba, 420, and hashish, or hash for short.
In the 70s, marijuana saw a lot of support. People gathered in public to share their marijuana and promote a world of free love. Yet there was parents and politicians that venomously opposed the legalization of marijuana. For the fear of their children and the next generation, marijuana was still considered an illegal drug and not passed to be legalized in the United States. At the turn of the century, people began to realize the medical benefits of legalizing medical marijuana. Currently, there are many states that are legalizing and decriminalizing marijuana in the United States. So here's my question to you. Are you in support of the legalization of medical marijuana, and why? Have you ever known anybody who has been helped by medical marijuana? If you are in opposition of the legalization of medical marijuana, why do you feel this way? Do you think it would be better if marijuana was illegal and banned from the United States?